You know that parents try to bend heaven and earth to get their kids into the best school that they can. When I lived in Oakland, California, I remember that there was this one high school, Skyline High, and everybody wanted their kids in town to go to that high school. It boasted graduates like Tom Hanks and basketball player Gary Payton. California is a school choice state, so you could try to get your high schooler into that school even if you lived in another part of town. Of course, there was a limit to the number of students who could attend that school, so there was a scrum among the parents each year to try to get their kids into that high school. There was a lottery system, so it was kind of fair in the selection process, but people always tried to figure out ways around it. We have a similar situation here in Peoria. Illinois is not a choice state, so you can't just choose which school you want your kids to attend. You have to go to the school that is closest to your place of residence. One of the ways that parents try to get around that requirement is by claiming that they live in the area of the school that they want to attend, even if they don't live there. Parents do this because they think their children will have more opportunities in life if they can go to a better school. And there's some evidence that they might be right about that. But if you have some doubts about the student districting policies in our district and states, I got something to show you this morning. This past week in the Indian state of Bihar, the State Examination Board had a week of exams, something like our standardized tests. Bihar is a very poor state, and most people think that the only way to get out of Bihar is to be a good student, to get into a good college, and get a good job. But the school system is so bad that the government started offering poorer students $160 if they could get even half the questions right on a standardized exam. Part of the reason why the schools are so bad is because they cannot pay qualified teachers. The government recently hired 400,000 teachers in Bihar, but they never tested them to see if they were competent as teachers. Many of the teachers could not even pass an exam designed for a 5th grader. You can just imagine how desperate and hopeless parents would be in a school system that bad, trying to get their kids out of poverty. So how do you help your kid get a leg up in this whole testing system? How do you help them get that $160? That goes a long way in Bihar. Well, I'll tell you how you do it. First of all, you bribe the people who monitor the testing. You actually pay them to look the other way while you help your son or daughter cheat on the exam. And then you help your kid pass the exam by sitting outside the window of the testing facility and sending in paper airplanes with the answers to the questions. Now you think I'm kidding, but here's a picture that served us from one of those testing facilities last week. Amazing, right? The whole situation is ridiculous. What meaning do test scores have if you can cheat on the test? If you've got mom and dad flying in paper airplanes with the answer? You can just imagine how frustrating and demoralizing it must be for people to try and face this completely corrupt system just because they want to give their kids a better chance in life. Now, if you can imagine the cynicism these people feel in Bihar about their educational system, you can begin to imagine how the people in Jesus' time felt about the corruption that went on in the temple at Jerusalem. The students of Bihar are victims of extreme poverty and unchecked corruption. What they really need is an advocate who will change the corruption and bring about systemic change in the way students are educated. The same was true in the case of the temple, which the Jews considered to be the absolute most holy place on the earth. The first Jewish temple was built in Jerusalem by King Solomon in the 10th century, in 968 BC. It was one of many building projects that Solomon undertook during his reign. And I've got a small timeline that I'm going to show you. Oh, hang on, not yet on that picture. Go forward. All right. I've got a timeline that I'll post on the church's Facebook page showing you the process of the temple and its history. His temple stood for hundreds of years, and it was still considered to be the place where God's glory was present on the earth. But during a siege of Jerusalem in 586, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple as a way of driving home just how much greater the Babylonian gods were than Israel's God. Later in that century, the Jews were allowed to return home and build their temple. That second temple that was built is the one which was standing in Jerusalem during Jesus' life. King Herod, yes, the one who tried to have Jesus killed when he was a toddler, spent vast sums of his own money renovating and expanding the temple. It was probably the greatest temple building in that part of the world during Jesus' ministry. And it was running, but the people who were in charge were running in a way which serves the people who worship are two different things. Under the administration of the high priests during the century before Jesus' ministry, the temple became more of a business than a place of worship. The customer base was the entire Jewish population in the Mediterranean basin. These leaders knew that in the book of Exodus, if you look in your Old Testament, Exodus chapter 30, God commanded every male over 19 years of age to pay a 1/2 shekel tax each year to support the priests and the upkeep of the temple. Most of the time, the men paid that tax when they came to Jerusalem in the spring to celebrate Passover. Obviously, that all sounds pretty kosher. You know, you take your money and you give it to the temple to support the upkeep. Except that since it was a tax to support the Jewish temple, you couldn't pay it with a Gentile coin. You couldn't pay it with money from some other country, like the country you lived in. A coin with the Roman emperor's face on it was considered to be unclean. So you had to have a currency exchange, which the priests offered conveniently at the temple. You can exchange your foreign money for the shekel right there at the temple. The catch? Well, let's put it this way. The fees that they charged were a complete ripoff. And everybody resented the priests for it. But they couldn't do anything about it because the priests had bribed the Roman officials well enough to keep themselves in power. You paid people off to let you be the high priest back then. And you can just guess where the money came from to pay off those Roman officials. You got it from the temple tax, among other monies. You can just imagine what the people thought of this whole temple system. They wanted to be obedient to God. But doing so meant that you had to put up with a totally corrupt priestly administration. This was one of many reasons why people resented the priesthood, even as they respected the priests as God's own intermediaries. In fact, people had been talking about God's impending judgment on the priests for at least 100 years before Jesus' ministry. There were even communities of Jewish monks who moved out of town and set up residence on the banks of the Dead Sea just to get away from all of the corruption in Jerusalem. They called themselves the sons of light, and of course the priests were the sons of darkness in their minds. They believed that God would destroy the priesthood in Jerusalem and give them the job of running the temple. And honestly, their prophecies about God bringing on the destruction of the priesthood in Jerusalem actually came true, just not in the way that they expected. Somewhere just before the time that Mark was writing this gospel, the Jewish people tried to revolt against their Roman occupiers. At first they were successful in driving the Romans out, but the Romans returned with a massive force under a general named Vespasian, and they laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed almost everything. One thing they made sure to do was to destroy the temple, just to make sure that the Jews wouldn't try to come back and rebuild it again. In that horrific event, the Jewish priesthood and its temple were gone forever. And many people, including the gospel writers, interpreted that destruction by the Romans of the temple as God's judgment on the priesthood. So as we celebrate Palm Sunday and we tell this story, we are reminded that Jesus didn't simply cleanse the temple during the final week of his life. He showed decisively that God was on the side of those who had been victimized by the temple's corruption. In doing so, he set an example for his followers, one in which he advocated on God's behalf for those who had been victimized. In a symbolic way, Jesus said what God had said many times in the Old Testament. If you victimize other people, if you take advantage of your position for your own profit, if you gain by deceiving people out of their money, God will not let it go. God will work in the world for the cause of those whom you victimize. The arc of justice will bend in their direction. For those of us who want to be Jesus' followers, his example of confronting corruption is one we must follow. God wants us to be mindful of the cause of the downtrodden, the poor, and those whose rights have been disregarded. Now, we may debate just who has been victimized in this world and who's really at fault for their victimization. But most of the time, people of faith know it when they see it. And this passage teaches us a few things about helping people go from being victims to being advocates. First of all, we cannot satisfy ourselves in the face of injustice by blaming individuals entirely for their situation in life. The people of Jesus' time were not poor simply because they were bad with their money, or they gambled too much, or they were too lazy, or they didn't want to work hard. A system had been put in place to keep them poor, and they had little power to do anything about it. You couldn't just build another temple and put the temple of Herod out of business. You couldn't vote the priests out of office. Jesus showed people how to live better, but he also confronted the system that kept them down that day. God's kingdom demanded nothing less of them. People have much greater freedom these days than they used to have, and they have significantly more power over the direction of their lives than people did in the past. People's personal choices have, to a great extent, determined the direction of their lives, much more so than in the past. Even though that is true, people are still victimized by a system designed to keep people down, designed to keep people in debt, designed to keep people spending their money no matter what. People are victimized by a system where people and corporations and groups with access to large amounts of cash have the power to greatly influence policy and the outcome of elections just because they have the money to pay, whether or not that policy is in the best interest of the public. People in other countries are victimized when the low prices that you and I enjoy for the stuff we buy comes on the back of people in the third world who have to work in almost slave-like conditions for little pay in factories with little regard for their safety or their well-being. Let me be clear. Creating a victim type of mentality is antithetical to our faith. People are accountable for their own choices to God and one another. But this passage recognizes that in this world there are many things that people have little power over. People's lives are greatly affected by government and economic systems and social systems in this world of which they sometimes have little influence. And when those systems work against people, when they keep people from being everything that God has created them to be, then we as Jesus' followers have to be willing to speak prophetically and say, you've made this into a den of robbers. The other point from this passage is that the results of the efforts we make to be faithful and prophetic often do not come right away. Sometimes the fruit of our labor doesn't appear for a very long time. Think about what happens in this story. Jesus announces God's judgment on the corruption in the temple. And what is the result? Well, it's not the thing that gets destroyed. He's the one that gets destroyed in this story. He gets executed less than a week later. So, was he a failure on Palm Sunday? It might look like it for a long time. In fact, the judgment that he talks about in Mark doesn't take place for another 40 years. 40 years go by before the corruption in the temple is dealt with permanently. In the same way, we need to keep in mind that God works over time in the events of history, not on our schedule. When you volunteer to work with the children or youth in our church, you don't do it because you think that this is what you have to do to grow the church and get young families to attend the church. You do it because someday, maybe 15 or 20 years from now, God will work in a special way in that young person's life. God can do that because back when they were younger, you were there for them. When you do your estate planning, your plans to give to the church won't make a lot of difference for the church right away. But your sacrificial giving will help the church be Christ's advocate for the downtrodden in this community later on in ways that you could have never imagined. When we get involved in the education of immigrants in our community, we are empowering them to confront systems in their own country that keep people poor and keep corrupt people in power. If they can graduate high school and then go on to college and get a better job, they will have a much easier time advocating for change back at home. They will be more prepared to deal with the way that some people in our society take advantage of immigrants. Jesus was a force for those who had been victimized by corrupt systems of power in his society. God also calls us to stand up for people who have no voice or have not yet found their voices. I want to close with a story about a young missionary from England who accepted a call from God to become a missionary to what was then the British colony of Jamaica. William Knibb accepted a post as a teacher at a school soon after he traveled to Jamaica. And that's a picture I was going to show you here. Here he is. He was devastated to see the condition of both that school in Jamaica and the people there. The school was a wreck, and many of the people were suffering under the scourge of slavery. There were probably 30,000 slaves working in various industries in Jamaica at the time that he came on behalf of the gospel. Fixing the school was fairly easy by comparison. He began preaching and opening churches, and soon he formed what became the Jamaican Baptist Association. But he soon came to realize that he could not share the entire gospel with the people of Jamaica while allowing slavery to go on. It just wasn't the full gospel. How can he talk about God freeing people from sin and the chains of sin while the chains of real-life slavery define their everyday lives? When he started talking about how slavery was evil and that they needed to do away with slavery, you can just imagine how the slave owners in Jamaica reacted. They had the authorities begin investigating Mr. Knibb. They paid the newspapers to publish vicious stories, lies about him, things that were really going on in the churches where he served. They even sent some of that material back to England to undermine him in the minds of the people back home. In one instance, one of the parishioners, a coveted slave named Sam Sidney, was forced to lie on the ground while being flogged by a bullwhip. Then Sidney was forced to work in the hot sun for 2 weeks on a chain gang as punishment for standing up against slavery. But all the while, as he suffered, William Knibb held his hand, assuring him of God's grace. Slave owners threatened to kill their slaves if they rebelled. When the slaves heard that they were going to do this, they revolted. And of course, authorities put Knibb in jail for inciting the revolt. After he served his term in jail, William Knibb returned to England, convinced that the only way he could live out his calling was to convince people in England to abolish slavery. But even the Baptist Association in England was skeptical about advocating for such a dramatic change. They told him that slavery was a political issue and that the church shouldn't be involved in politics. He vowed to walk barefoot through the entire United Kingdom if that's what it took to make English Christians aware of the effects of slavery in Jamaica. That's exactly what he did for the next 2 years, illustrating for the people of England what was going on. He went far and wide, telling people about the treatment of slaves in Jamaica. People were furious when they heard the stories that he told. He didn't stop until July 31st, 1833, when the British Parliament outlawed slavery in all of the British colonies. They also provided money to rebuild all of the schools and the churches and the homes that had been burned by slave owners who tried to stop him from protesting slavery. Now, if you think that this is all ancient news and water under the bridge, there is a William Knibb Memorial School. You might have a picture. There it is. In Jamaica, this is what it looks like today. And there's another picture of the William Knibb Memorial Baptist Church. His tireless efforts changed the lives of millions of people in the British Empire who had suffered under slavery for so long. And his example still inspires people today to stand up against corrupt systems that keep people from achieving their God-given potential. May we be willing to stand with those who are oppressed today the way that Jesus stood with them on Palm Sunday. We cannot be satisfied watching people suffer and to say to ourselves, hey, you win some in life and you lose some. Jesus showed us that God is on the side of justice. We have to be willing to be patient. We must be content with the knowledge that sometimes we will not quickly see the fruits of our labor. We go forward trusting that God is at work in all things. May this place, this church, always be a house of prayer for the furthering of God's kingdom in the world. Let us pray. Oh God, we